I have the dubious distinction of being a professional economist, a profession which has distinguished itself, I am sad to say, by having almost nothing to say about the cataclysms we're living through, simply out of embarrassment that it was not supposed to happen according to their theory, and therefore, as so many good professors, if it wasn't supposed to happen, then it didn't. And I assume my illustrious colleagues on this panel invited me in part so I could bring to you a different economics perspective. I'm going to try to do that in a short amount of time by tying together a number of themes everyone touched on. The theme of our economic problems, divisions, the theme of capitalism, and above all, the theme of what a moral agenda for the future ought to look like. Let me begin by reminding you of an earlier moment like this, in fact, two of them, in our country's history, from which we can learn. In the struggle against slavery in the 19th century, American slavery, you might divide the people who found slavery awful into two groups. One group was horrified by how slaves were treated, how they were fed, clothed, their families broken up, beaten, all of that. And they devoted themselves to a struggle to improve the condition of the slaves. Better diets, better clothing, keep their families together. And then there was a second group of people who were horrified not only by slavery, but by the first group of those who opposed it. They looked at their brothers and sisters in that other movement, and they said, "You're missing the most powerful and basic moral issue of the time. The problem is not how we treat the slaves. The problem is that there are such a thing as slaves." When they were pushed to explain their upset, they made a further argument, and you're going to see how I use it in a minute for our times today. The further argument they made was, even if you and we struggle to improve the diet, the clothing, the housing, and so on of slaves, as long as they remain slaves, whatever we win can and probably will be taken away by the master in the future, just as it was taken away by the master in the past, which is why the solution is not improving their situation, but transforming it into something utterly different. Now move forward with me to our present system, which isn't slavery, it's capitalism. There is no way out of a discourse, of a discussion of capitalism. And as the others have pointed out, not the least of the contributions of the Occupy movement has been to put this issue of capitalism on the agenda of American discourse again. And that is an extraordinary achievement. For 50 years, half a century, it has basically been impossible to discuss in a reasonable and rational way the institution of capitalism as an economic system. If you discussed it in the United States, you had to effectively become a cheerleader. Discourse, criticism was akin to disloyalty. It became impossible or very dangerous to go there. This movement has put it on the agenda. Over the last 50 years, we as a nation debated our educational system, criticized and debated it, our transportation system, our medical system, our welfare system, and on, but not our economic system. Oh yes, we could complain a little bit that wages should be a bit higher, that people shouldn't be thrown out of their homes by foreclosure. This should sound familiar to you. We were worrying, and we still worry, about the conditions of the working people of America, like we might have been upset about the conditions of the slaves back in the Old South. But then there has to be a moral voice coming up and saying, the issue isn't whether workers' wages should be higher, their job conditions better, their security of work higher. There's a deeper and more profound moral problem, and that's the problem of the capitalist system. And let me explain briefly what I mean. I don't mean who owns things. And I don't mean whether we have a market or a planning system. If you look at most economies in the world, they're mixtures of those things anyway. I'm talking about the capitalist way of organizing how we produce the goods and services that most of us work on most of our adult lives, and that we all depend on for our food, our clothing, our shelter, and everything else we do. We organize that in a way that has to be a question and an issue for a moral agenda. And I want to end by making a plea to put it on a moral agenda in the following terms. We organize the production of goods and services in the United States in an extraordinary capitalist way. It's normal to capitalism. I want to raise it as a moral issue. We go to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, most of us. We walk into a workplace in which we are told what to do, how to do it, and when we're done using our brains and muscles to work with tools provided to us, on raw materials set before us, in ways dictated to us, when we're done pouring our creativity into our work, it's 5 o'clock. We are told to go home, and what we have produced stays there. And for those of us who don't understand that, who have, like a young child, the desire to take home what we have made, they send people in dark blue uniforms to our homes, and they hurt us. My point is not just, although it's important, that there's a moral question about whether human beings who collectively and cooperatively produce the wealth of a society are unable to participate in the decisions as to what is done with what they have produced. That is a profound moral question. It ought to be part of our national discourse. But that's not my primary point. Here's my primary point, because it touches the economic crisis we're in. For the last 30 years, for those of you not familiar with the statistics of the society we live in, for the last 30 years, the real wages, the amount of stuff an average American gets per hour of his or her labor, has not changed. The real wage per hour or per week of an American worker today, the money you get adjusted for the prices of the things you pay for, is about what it was in 1978. The only way the consumption level of the American people has risen in 30 years is by two acts the American people decided to take to cope with the end of rising wages, because they had risen in America for 150 years before that, before the 1970s. The first thing American workers did was work more hours. The working class of the United States today does more hours of paid labor per year than the working class of any other country in this planet. We are working ourselves to death. The second thing the American working class did to keep its consumption going, when working more hours wasn't enough, when sending women, old people, and teenagers out to work wasn't enough, was to go on a borrowing binge, the likes of which the world had never seen before. That plastic credit card you have in your wallet was put there in the 1970s. Before that, the masses had no credit card, in order to get you into the levels of debt that now keep you up at night. The American working class, therefore, is now exhausted from its work conditions, which are a product of the capitalist system in which we live. But over the last 30 years, since the 1970s, while the wages were flat, the productivity of the American working class kept rising. We worked harder. We were better educated. We had more machines, we had better machines, and we had computers. So for 30 years, while what we got in wages was flat, what we produced for our employers kept rising. You do not need a PhD in economics, although I have that. You don't need it to understand if what the employer gives you is flat for 30 years, but what you give the employer goes up for 30 years, it's bad news for you and good news for them. Now the last part. Those employers, who are now a very small number of our people, my goodness, you might even say, oh, I don't know, 1%. Those 1% are not stupid. They understood that becoming as wealthy as these 30 years made them, when the rest of the society couldn't go there and was getting deeper into debt and exhausted, that you better control the political system, otherwise the people who are falling behind will try to use the political system to cope with their situation. So why are we surprised if in this system that makes 1% so wealthy, they should use a portion of their wealth to make sure that politics keeps them where they are? Of course they would, of course they did, and we live with the consequences. Last part. This is the second major economic crisis of Western capitalism in 75 years. We are now in the 5th year. The official start of this economic downturn, as declared by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which keeps records, was December of 2007. Count it. We are in the 5th year, and there's no end in sight. The last time we were in a situation as dire as this was the Great Depression of the 1930s. And here's the most profound moral lesson about our history since then. In the depths of that depression, when the official unemployment rate was 25%, 2.5 times what it is now, when people said even more strongly then than they do now, there's no money to help people, we have to cut back. We have to cut back. A movement arose from below in America. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, the most powerful union organizing wave ever to sweep across America, bigger than anything that had happened before, bigger than anything that has happened since. Millions of American workers in months across the major industries. Powerful socialist and communist parties in the United States. I'm reminded, just to give you an idea of what could happen. Not only were there a communist party, but it was strong here in New York and up here on the Upper West Side. And you even had a communist party put forward an African-American man to run for the City Council of New York. And because we had proportional representation in the elections in New York, yes, we did. He won. Benjamin Davis was a black communist elected to the city council of New York.
That's right.
And what else was possible when they had a strong union movement and a socialist movement and a communist movement? You transformed the president, a namby-pamby centralist president, we would call him centralist now, balanced budget Roosevelt, was turned around. He found money, staggering amounts of money. In the midst of the Depression, he created the Social Security system. We never had that before. In the middle of the Depression, he created the unemployment compensation system in America. We never had that before. But best of all, in the middle of the Depression in 1934, he goes on the radio, this centralist president, namby-pamby fellow, a one-percenter if there ever was one. And he says, roughly I quote, if the private sector in America either cannot or will not provide jobs for the millions of Americans who don't have them, then the only option is for the federal government to do that. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million jobs. My goodness. My goodness. We now live in a time when we have a serious economic problem, and not only is there no federal jobs program, there isn't even a discussion of one. My goodness, how far we have come. All those things were possible. Corporations were taxed for a lot of the money to pay for that. Rich people were taxed for a lot of the money to pay for that. That's right. Roosevelt said to them, you better pay me those taxes, you corporations and you rich people. Because if you don't, and if you don't give me the money to make things better for the mass of people, down the road are coming the CIO, the socialists and the communists, they're going to cut you a much worse deal. And half of them bought it. But then, in my humble opinion, and here's the moral issue, the CIO, the socialists and the communists made a fundamental strategic mistake. They endorsed Roosevelt, who became the most popular president in American history. Won re-election 4 times. No president had ever done that before. It so freaked out the Republicans, they immediately had to pass a law after he was dead so that nobody could do that again. But here's the mistake. They got Social Security, they got improvement, they got jobs. But they didn't touch the organization of the capitalist enterprise. They left the shareholders and the boards of directors in position. So no sooner were the reforms passed, no sooner were the regulations passed, no sooner was the social welfare created, than we left in place the boards of directors and shareholders, for whom these are all obstacles to profit maximization. And they went to work over the last 40 years to eradicate, to undo what had been done, and they mostly have succeeded. Emblematic, the Glass-Steagall Act, the banking control that was referred to earlier. Banks should not mix depositors' money with risky investments. They worked to undo that. And finally, after years, they succeeded. They got the Congress to get rid of that law. And in 1999, President Clinton signed the law that repealed it. And 8 years later, wiped back down into a financial crisis, as if a critic of capitalism like me had written the script. The lesson here is our moral problem and a moral agenda item. If we don't want to continue to have a system that poses 1% over here and 99% over there, that plunges people into debts that are beyond words, that are now burdening an entire generation of college and university students with a debt burden before they graduate. Impossible to carry. That gives so much money to so few that they can easily buy the political system with all its cons. If we don't want that, there is no option to what we have learned. We must deal with and change the capitalist organization of our producing enterprises. No more masses of people here and a tiny handful of shareholders and boards of directors over here. 1% of shares in the United States, 1% of shareholders own 75% of the shares. To allow our business enterprises to be controlled by shareholders and boards of directors is a fundamental denigration and denial of democracy. If we want democracy in our lives, we are a peculiar people. Most of our adult lives is spent 5 out of 7 days a week, most of the hours of those days, at work. If democracy is a value, it ought to begin in the workplace rather than in our society being exempted at the workplace. I think, in conclusion, that our history teaches us that we are once again where the people were in the 1930s. Are we going to try again to develop a movement along the lines that my fellow panelists have spoken about so eloquently? And let's suppose Occupy is the first step, as I know we all hope it is and will be. We must learn from the mistake that was made last time, not for this or that improvement, but for the kind of change without which any of the improvements we can achieve will not be secure. The moral issue I would add to the agenda for the future is, finally, after 50 years when it was taboo, and thanks to Occupy, capitalism has once more to be put front and center as something we are free to criticize, something we are free to debate, and something which we as a society have to have the freedom to determine may no longer be what we need or want. Imagine an Occupy a year from now raising the slogan, America can do better than capitalism. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Brother Wolff.
Brother Wolff.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's powerful. That's powerful, man.
Powerful.
Oh, you laid that out. You laid that thing out.
Whoa.
Yeah. I think we ought to move to the demos here. Yes, that was rich. Boy, that was rich. You got that on tape, right? Yeah, right on. That's cool. That's cool.